Welcome, everybody. Professor Hanchard, dear Joseph Serunkuma, who I believe is online and can probably hear me already, dear Violetta, dear students, distinguished guests, friends, and colleagues, it's my great honor and pleasure to open this year's Distinguished Equality Lecture. This lecture series stands out from other events we host at the Hertie School because it is not just an important occasion to learn about a crucial topic from an outstanding speaker, even though it is also that. But it is also an institutional commitment that builds on the work of Mark Hallerberg during his tenure as president in the academic year 2020-21, when he decided that we needed to shed light on the politics of exclusion that we witness in history and all the way until the present day in order to understand what we can do as stewards of good governance to combat against them. And this goes to the heart of our university's motto, understand today, shape tomorrow. Today's Distinguished Equality Lecture is the annual highlight in a continuing series of events featuring leading academics whose work advanced the understanding of the deep causes of inequality, social cohesion, and inclusion. At a time where social tensions and divisions between different parts of society are growing in many countries, we want to provide a forum for rigorous, evidence-based discussion about the conditions that enable more cohesive and inclusive communities. Bringing together researchers, students, and practitioners, this lecture series fosters dialogue across disciplines and perspectives on the mechanisms and systemic features that create unequal life conditions in our societies. The question is not new, but it certainly feels that it has gotten more intense, possibly because the fight for equality has become politicized itself. Diversity, equity, and inclusions are now words to be avoided, and it's become socially acceptable again to call for a return to times of outright discriminatory standards. The battle to defend liberal democracy in our times therefore entails asking hard questions about the state as provider of welfare, as a guarantor of the rule of law, and as the monopoly of violence. What kind of state do we want, and who is responsible when the state fails to protect us? On this topic, I cannot think of a better speaker than our distinguished guest, Professor Michael Hanchard. He is the Gustav Kümmerle Professor in the African Studies Department at the University of Pennsylvania and Director of the Marginalized Populations Project. Professor Hanchard's research explores how structural inequalities shape the experience of democracy and citizenship. His latest work invites us to reconsider the deep roots of democratic erosion, pointing out that factors like discrimination, exclusion, and social stratification can undermine trust in democratic institutions, even where formal democratic rules exist. Joining him in discussion is Dr. Serunkuma, who joins us online. And I'm nodding to the left because your screen is on the left, but you probably see me here. He is an anthropologist and postdoctoral researcher at Martin Luther University in Halle-Wittenberg. Dr. Serunkuma's expertise is in nationalism, decolonial studies, and social justice, where he brings a vital perspective on how global structural inequalities reverberate back to local experiences of protection, inclusion, and belonging. The conversation will be moderated by Professor Violetta Moreno-Lax, our newly appointed Wübben Professor of International Law and Director of the Hertie School Center for Fundamental Rights, an ideal chair for exploring the legal, social, and moral dimensions of state responsibility in protecting human dignity. And as you can see, and you probably realize if you know the Hertie School well, tonight's event is a wonderful example of cooperation across a lot of different sectors of our university so that we can live up to our ambition to look profoundly and institutionally on equality. Allow me therefore to thank all the colleagues who joined forces to set up a truly fascinating panel. The Distinguished Equality Lecture was made possible first and foremost by our Hertie School Social Policy Group under the able leadership of Professor Michaela Kreinfeld and Ruth Dittelmann, even though I'm pretty sure you will say it wasn't leadership, it was just coordination. And the Social Policy Group is a lively collection of distinguished scholars with expertise on all aspects of the politics that ensure cohesion and welfare, social policy and labor markets, health, family, and education, but also studies the demographic composition and the social psychology that provides the glue in our communities. In addition, I'd like to thank all our colleagues from the Center for Fundamental Rights, headed by Violetta Moreno-Lax, and Michal, who always makes everything happen on the sideline. And Violetta, as you've heard, will lead us through tonight's discussion. Our office, this is the Office of the President, but in the Office of the President, our Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, represented here by Susan Park-Gessner and Kibber Chewing, also joined forces in the preparation months ago to set up tonight's event. And finally, as always, a warm word of welcome to our communications team, which is standing a little bit of everywhere. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Tuha, and thank you also to Benjamin. At the Hertie School, we're committed to embedding equality, equity, diversity, and inclusion in our daily work. Diversity is not simply an ideal, it is a source of strength, innovation, and good governance. May this lecture stimulate new perspectives, deepen our understanding, and strengthen our shared commitment to building just, inclusive, and resilient societies. Professor Hanchard, let me welcome you on stage, and once again, a warm welcome here at the Hertie School.
Thank you very much, President Vold, for that warm introduction. I'd like to thank Michaela Kranfeld, Alwyn Harp, Yusuf Kuma, who delivered some comments, as well as all the others involved, Violetta Moreno-Lax, and others who were involved in the arrangements for this talk and presentation. This talk is excerpted from a book manuscript I'm currently working on. I'm okay, thank you. I'm currently working on a relationship between democracy and unequal orders, fascism among them. Like many in the United States and elsewhere, I've observed the Trump regime with some combination of dread and scholarly fascination, as I considered the prospect or reality of contemporary fascism in the United States. But the more I observed and read, I grew convinced that what we are witnessing and observing now is not fascism per se, but what political scientists would refer to as electoral authoritarianism, and a combination of electoral authoritarianism and what I'm calling racial rule, which I'll describe momentarily. Both regimes, racial rule and authoritarianism, have longer histories than fascism does in the United States. Their common origin lies somewhere between the end of the Civil War and the end of Reconstruction, which, as Stephen Hahn and Robert Paxton both suggest, provides ample evidence to suggest that racial rule predates fascism. Fascist regimes are inconceivable without racial rule. The 19th century scramble for Africa, the consolidation of Western nation-state dominance over Asian, African, the Gulf states, and the Middle East, exemplified the terms of settlement in the Treaty of Versailles, set the terms for the proliferation of racial rule throughout the nation-state system. The concept of racial rule provides the means to link the earliest days of fascism, what we say was fascism in Italy and Germany, to contemporary neo-fascist and other white supremacist mobilizations in many parts of the world, by placing fascism in some historical and comparative context. In the history of politics from the 18th century onwards, racial and ethno-national rule has served as the connective tissue, linking various features and forms of inegalitarian orders and nation states, right-wing authoritarian populism, fascism, and of colonialism and totalitarianism, but also to democratic polities, to those same inegalitarian orders. Part of this I'll focus on today is on organizations created by subjugated black populations for the purposes of collective defense in the United States, and in the larger book project to all other polities in the Americas. Brazil is the shadow case in some ways, but for lack of time, I can't really unpack that one. Time limits constrain my ability to elaborate more examples, but I hope to have provided enough for this audience to consider the conceptual, theoretical, and comparative implications of racial rule imposed upon black and brown populations in the United States. Viewed with a comparative lens, primed to pay attention to history and politics, this talk represents one attempt to respond to the following question: how do the defenseless respond to racial and ethno-national rule? I'm assuming that some members of this audience are familiar with the era of Reconstruction after the U.S. Civil War and the violent white reaction to black suffrage, voluntary cessation, and freedom relative to enslavement in the U.S. South. And I'm doing a sort of tabulation here so that when we come back to this, we'll understand the linkage between Reconstruction and a contemporary moment. But I'm going to start with a sordid example from Reconstruction. This is from the pioneering work by Thelani Davis, a historian, a book called The Emancipation Circuit, in which he details how the period of Reconstruction in the U.S. South, 1865 to 1867, brought challenges for black people unaccustomed to operating as freed persons in the public sphere, and for a white power structure and general populace, not only unaccustomed to treating blacks as equals, but without legal codes that recognize blacks as citizens. One example of the lack of recognition of black citizenship in the South during Reconstruction was the uproar and violence generated by whites in Mobile, Alabama, at the sight of free black women in the public sphere for the first time in U.S. history. In Davis's account, during the summer of 1865, police officers arrested black women in the public square and gave them a choice: submit to imprisonment or rape, which Davis recognizes as a double bind. For imprisonment greatly increased the possibility that these women would be sexually assaulted anyway. The fact that, this is quote, page 223, the fact that many black women were rounded up in groups like animals in a herd and assaulted systematically in a public fashion simply added to the public message that no blacks were free, right? Protestations by siblings, husbands, children, relatives, and concerned black citizens, newly enfranchised citizens, often generated more violence by police, white mobs, and paramilitary organizations. Davis's account documents another incident of exemplary violence deployed upon the black population, gendered female in its iteration. This account is similar to the use of rape as a tool of subjugation by Serbian soldiers imposed upon Croatian women in Sarajevo during the Bosnian War between 1992 and 1995. Davis's account of racialized and gendered violence is but one instance of the myriad forms of violence and denial of dignity awaiting those blacks who would venture out into the public sphere. So another question: how did the formerly enslaved and their descendants respond to such humiliation and violation to both dignity and personhood? By the early 20th century in the United States, Afro-descendant organizations and communities created self-defense organizations in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Rosewood, Florida, New York City, Houston, and other locales. Many situations involved black soldiers returning from the battlefronts in Europe during World War I and in the Philippines. From Jamaica came the Universal Negro Improvement Association, known as UNIA. How many familiar with UNIA? No one? Okay, it's the Universal Negro Improvement Association. To this day, it's the largest mass mobilization of Afro-descendant populations throughout the world. It was founded by a man by the name of Marcus Garvey. There's extensive scholarship on him. The UNIA had a transnational military wing called the Legionnaires, with chapters in many former slaveholding societies in the Americas, including but not limited to the United States. Robert Hill, editor of the multi-volume compendium of primary material of the papers of Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, has documentary evidence of 936 UNI divisions in the United States alone. The breakdown of divisions by region is also interesting as an indication of where black communities responded to the need for collective defense. The largest number of the divisions were in the U.S. South, 482 chapters, followed by 241 in the Midwest, 138 divisions in the Mid-Atlantic states, 48 in the Southwest and West, and 27 divisions in New England. The principal strategic document of the UNIA, the Declaration of the Rights of the Negro Peoples, ended with, quote, "On behalf of the 400 million Negroes of the world, do pledge therein the sacred blood of the race in defense," end quote. Black self-defense and public brandishing of weapons was prohibited in much of the South, but also in parts of the North as well. White supremacist organizations like the Regulators and the Ku Klux Klan, often with the help of local governments, killed and injured many formerly enslaved black people with impunity. Now, the Legionnaires, the military wing of the UNIA, had purchased rented buildings in various parts of the United States. And scholar Tony Martin writes that it was not uncommon for Liberty Halls, that they were called, give the emphasis on liberty, to be raided by the authorities. Probably the most serious of these episodes was one which came to be known in UNIA circles as the Chattanooga outrage, in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The incident took place on August 4th, 1927, when, in the words of the Negro World, this was a newspaper and journal going back to my childhood days, and one of my aunts was a beauty queen, so she was on the front cover of the Negro World, a moment of pride in our household. It was not uncommon for Liberty Halls to be raided by the authorities. Possibly the most serious of these episodes came to be known in USA circles as the Chattanooga outrage. On August 4th, 1927, quote, a mob of white devils raided a peaceful meeting in Chattanooga, Tennessee, killed and wounded and imprisoned several Garveyites. The police had already prohibited UNIA from convening meetings. And the members of the Universal African Legions, the Legionnaires, stationed at the door, requested the police to produce warrants authorizing their entry, whereupon the police refused and opened fire. The Legionnaires returned the fire, resulting in casualties on both sides. The Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, a black-owned newspaper, that generally had hostile articles. They did not like Garvey very much, but they expressed indignation at the treatment of the Legionnaires. An editorial in the newspaper said the following: the Chattanooga riot represents the typical Southern white reaction to colored organizations provided with military uniforms and weapons. In Tennessee, a Negro cannot join the state militia, but he can join the African Guards of Garvey, and the women are recruited as Black Cross nurses. Now, what does this have to do with the more contemporary moment? The Legionnaires' legacy of self-defense impressed subsequent generations of black activists. For example, Geronimo Pratt, former Minister of Defense for the Black Panther Party in the 1970s, and a Vietnam veteran, traced his knowledge and ultimate participation in community self-defense organizations to an uncle who was a member of the UNIA Legionnaires. In an interview, Pratt contrasted the martial practices of the Legionnaires and other similar organizations with church-based, nonviolent organizations that preached peace. Quote, black people had always rallied behind our preachers, but they were old men living in the past. They loved everybody, shuffled off to City Hall with hat in hand. Yes, sir. No, sir, Mr. Whitey. No, sir. The Legionnaires were more like army troops, so he's setting up a contrast. So who were these individuals and organizations who sought to defend themselves from these violent onslaughts? In addition to concerned citizens and semi-citizens, blacks with combat experience in various wars mobilized collectively when they came home. Christopher Sebastian Parker's book, Fighting for Democracy, is very good in this regard, as he offers keen insights into the contestations of what I'm calling racial rule. Parker illuminates the psychological and moral dissonance experienced by black veterans at the discovery that their national service during times of war was no guarantee of full citizenship rights and benefits at home. And there have been instances when black soldiers enlisted in the U.S. Armed Forces have responded to white violence. One instance in 1917, August 23rd, in the city of Houston, Texas. Over 100 black soldiers of the decorated all-black 3rd Battalion of the 24th Industry decided to march on the city of Houston after weeks of beatings, insults, arrests, and assaults by city policemen. Two separate incidents are significant. I use the extensive paragraph below from the first volume of David Levering Lewis's stellar biography of W.B. Du Bois because I cannot match his eloquence, historical acuity, and psychoanalytic insight. This is quoting from Lewis. On the night of August 23rd, the black soldiers of the 3rd Battalion marched from Camp Logan into Houston with Sergeant Vida Henry and Corporal Charles W. Baltimore of the military police in the lead, just an all-black regiment. That morning, Corporal Baltimore had been beaten, shot at, and then arrested by a city policeman for having the nerve to inquire about another battalion member who had been thrown in jail for trying to stop the beating of a black woman by a policeman. Both men had been released to their white captain later in the day. After weeks of insults, assaults, Jim Crow trolleys and cinemas. Everybody know what Jim Crow is? Okay. Jim Crow trolleys and cinemas, just want to make sure. The African-American regulars of the 24th century, quote, cut through downtown Houston like a Sith. Moving in an assault formation on the nearest police station, they shot dead 16 white, including 5 policemen, and wounded 11 others in 2 hours. 2 black citizens were killed. 4 members of the 3rd Battalion died. 1, Mr. Sergeant Henry, by his own hand. Here was the fulfillment of America's deepest fear. Deep, bloody black retribution, the other element besides sex, at dead center of the historic psychosis about race, end quote. The Houston example has implications for how racialized state power is wielded, as well as implications for how marginalized populations in many nation states have been alternatively advantaged and disadvantaged by their embeddedness and allegiance to state power. One of the psychological cues in the Houston incident is what I'm calling black alienation, evident in the moment the battalion leadership and rank and file decided to deploy their military training upon the white population, a populace that they, in theory, were trained to defend. White violence directed at black soldiers was not only an enactment of racism, but also a means to display white sovereignty over black embodiments of state power. The classic definition of alienation, going back to the Greeks, connotes the separation of a person from a people or a people from their land. The city of Houston, Texas, placed that battalion in a double bind. They could neither represent the state nor be protected by it. The police, another dimension of the coercive apparatus, not the black soldier, could exact violence with impunity. This led in the subsequent trial of several executions, court-martials, and imprisonments. Moving forward, in the 1960s, several black organizations in the United States, Austria, New Zealand, Canada, and Jamaica devoted to black freedoms advocated violence or at a minimum encouraged self-defense in black communities. By the 1970s in the United States, the Symbionese Liberation Army, known mostly for their kidnapping of the newspaper heiress Patty Hearst, the Black Liberation Army, and most notably the Black Panthers, that the most well-known but not necessarily the most effective, but I can get into that in the Q&A. Now, the perceived need for instruments and tactics for self-defense in black communities, coupled with anxieties among elites of the prospect of armed revolt, has continued into the 21st century. Let's consider one example, and I'll give you another quiz. I'm undefeated in this quiz. How many have ever heard of an organization with the acronym NFAC? Anyone? Okay. NFAC is short for the Not Fucking Around Coalition. I'm serious. In May of 2019, the NFAC, as it was referred to, announced its presence to the world in response to white supremacist demonstrations, slaughter, mayhem, and injury of black citizens. Led by a man by the name of John Fitzgerald Johnson from Atlanta, Georgia, NFAC at one time had a membership estimated at over 1,100 people. Most accounts place the geographic origins of the NFAC in Atlanta, Georgia. Mr. Johnson went by the nickname as Jam Master Jay, that's the name of a famous DJ, with a former enlisted serviceman in the U.S. Army. The organization's stated purpose was to protect the lives of black citizens, using Malcolm X's oft-quoted phrase, by any means necessary. In several interviews, Mr. Johnson was quoted as saying, we'll see a clip in a minute, we're not here to sing or hold up posters. We don't want to talk no more. We don't want to negotiate. We don't want to sing songs. And we don't want to bring signs to a gunfight. We are an eye for an eye organization. With approximately 1,100 black men and women, many with experience in the military and or law enforcement, their objective was to provide a defense barrier around black communities victimized by white violence. This is 2019. In response to the 2020 murder of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, Mr. Johnson led a march of the NFAC members to Stone Mountain, Georgia. I mean, familiar with Stone Mountain, Georgia? What was Stone Mountain, Georgia? Yeah, exactly, Confederate monument. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis. Now we can do the video clip. This is a clip. This is an interview with Mr. James Fitzgerald Johnson, and a clip of Grandmaster Jay, and then a clip showing the marching of the militia.
However, when white folks decide they want to pick up guns and run up on state houses and threaten the police and nothing happens, black folks see that and go, well, you know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And as you all know, it's no fun when the rabbit has the gun. So to be honest with you, we, again, are not a mob. And we're not talking about something that we feel about. We're looking at a situation that is deteriorating, and we feel we have to defend ourselves. Our policing models are broken. Remote policing does not work. We feel there's a need for us to get back to community policing. We feel there's a need for us to start protecting our own communities again under the laws that are established in the land, and also the educating of our own people. Not just gun clubs, but the actual ability that a gun is necessary for you to have on your person legally in this apartheid-like environment that we live in the United States.
Okay. So from the actions and rhetoric of NFAC, it would appear that the organization's enemies were white supremacists, not white people. Mr. Johnson regularly notified state and local governments of NFAC's intention to march in various cities and routinely obtained gun and marching permits. In essence, NFAC was a public militia with clearly stated objectives and not a clandestine organization. At some level, Mr. Johnson, I believe, wanted legitimacy and recognition of his cause. Moreover, Georgia is an open carry state, so NFAC's display of firearms should have been well within public law. Yet the public display of firearms generated popular white anxiety in Georgia and elsewhere, and increased attention by the surveillance apparatuses of the FBI, CIA, and local police departments, despite the fact that the NFAC did not commit acts of violence. I think there's one death associated with with the organization's movements, but by a member who wasn't an official member of the movement. But in preparation for a rally in Louisiana in 2017, Mr. Johnson and NFAC members were observed by federal task force officers who were perched atop a building. It was alleged by the FBI that Mr. Johnson pointed his firearm at the federal officers, though both the officers and Mr. Johnson acknowledged that they were in conversation about what scenarios to expect at a rally with a crowd consisting of NFAC members, federal officers, interested observers, and members of white supremacist groups. Arrested on December 3rd, 2020, Mr. Johnson, who you just saw, was sentenced to federal prison for 7 years and 2 months for allegedly aiming a rifle at a federal officer without a shot being fired. By contrast, and his imprisonment has effectively spelled the end of NFAC, and I talk about that in the Q&A. By contrast, the Ku Klux Klan has been in existence in some form since the end of Civil War. NFAC had a shelf life of 4 years. In one of the few journalistic accounts of the organization, an interview with Mr. Johnson, Graham Wood, who was a writer for the Atlantic magazine, described the NFAC troops in formation in Louisville, Kentucky in the following manner, quote, "The men and women are ragtag and amateur, and their uniforms are not well uniformed. They look like World War II partisans meeting a clandestine commander for the first time. They look like World War II partisans meeting their clandestine commanders for the first time." Wood's comparison of NFAC's likeness to World War II partisans requires additional conceptual and historical nuance to understand what it means to be a black partisan in the country of one's birth, alienated from the very state power that, in theory, bears the responsibility of its protection. Neither Graham's account nor Carl Schmitt, who I will elaborate below, I'm sure you're familiar with Carl Schmitt, contemplate the idea of a partisan without a territorial dominion, much less a state. For even the partisans of World War II, whether in Belgium, France, Italy, Spain, or Germany, were a combination of what are often referred to as irregular troops of the same nationality, or internationalists who perceived the fall of the French and Spanish republics, in particular, as part of a larger battle between fascist and anti-fascist forces. Partisan combatants have historically been composed of citizens of a country engaged in asymmetrical combat with an army of occupation that has defeated the army of the sovereign state that can no longer offer protection to their citizens and territory. Consequently, what remains of the state may request their one sovereign population to take up arms against an invading, occupying force. Now here's Schmidt's explication of the problem of the partisan. And he, according to Schmidt, it begins with the guerrilla war waged by Spanish citizens against the occupying French army between 1808 and 1813. Now Schmidt writes, this is from this theory of the partisan. In this war, quote, a people, a pre-bourgeois, pre-industrial, pre-conventional nation, for the first time confronted a modern, well-organized, regular army that had evolved from the experience of the French Revolution. Thereby, new horizons of war opened, new concept of war developed, and a new theory of war and politics emerged. Schmidt's declaration of the novelty of Spanish civilian engagement in asymmetrical warfare with a formal standing army, however, a nation-state requires qualification. The Haitian Revolution began 17 years before Spanish popular resistance to French occupation of Spain. The enslaved of Saint-Domingue utilized guerrilla tactics that French army commanders and soldiers were unfamiliar with and fought the French army to a standstill, and I must add the Spanish and British armies as well. Much is written about the Haitian Revolution, so readers consult with the now ample first-rate scholarship on a revolution that for too long was considered an anomaly in relation to other 18th and 19th century revolutions. And here I'm thinking about, for students, the work of Michel Rolfe-Triot, Laurent Dubois, Gwendolyn Midlo Hall, and a host of other people. Thus, the form of Spanish resistance to French occupation was not unprecedented, at least in the terms attributed to it by Schmidt. Nevertheless, Schmidt's claims provide an opportunity for theorization of NFAC and other similar partisan formations in polities with racial and ethno-national hierarchies. The NFAC pose a distinct conceptual challenge, I think. Since many of its members were once enlisted in the U.S. Armed Forces or employed by various branches of municipal and state police, NFAC could have been categorized as a paramilitary organization. Yet if they're a paramilitary organization, should they be distinguished from other paramilitary organizations in the U.S. and elsewhere, whose expressed aim is to create an ethno-state devoid of non-whites? The actions of NFAC, like many of its predecessors within black communities, were ultimately criminalized, its leadership imprisoned, its organization bankrupted. One of the recurring predicaments of black self-defense organizations that have encountered throughout history is the absence of laws providing group rights and or protective status to citizens endangered by the state and many of its citizens. Put another way, in a polity premised upon laws protecting the status and condition of individual citizens, the invocation of practical group rights for collectivities have been treated as unlawful. Over the past several years, there have been several noticeable extrajudicial killings of black people by police and by white citizens. In 2016, Philando Castile, a 32-year-old black male with license to carry a concealed weapon in Minnesota, was shot dead by a police officer in front of his daughter and girlfriend after displaying his licensed weapon in a holster on his shirt. It's a very graphic and disturbing video, so for reasons of the delicate, I wouldn't show it, but it basically shows Mr. Castile opening up his shirt to reveal that he has a weapon, and he's about to give the police officer the certificate of license, and the police officer shoots him dead on the spot. He had not drawn his weapon, nor given any indication that he attempted to do so. 1 year later, the police officer was acquitted of second-degree manslaughter charges and 2 counts of unlawful discharge of a weapon. By contrast with the demise of NFAC, consider the case of Kyle Rittenhouse in 2020, who in Kenosha, Wisconsin, at a rally, ironically protesting the extrajudicial killing of an unarmed black man, George Floyd, who I'm sure you're familiar with. Rittenhouse was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder and pled not guilty on the claim of self-defense, even though the 3 people he shot were unarmed. According to Wisconsin state law, it's unlawful for someone under the age of 18 to possess a firearm. He possessed a firearm. The gun possession charge was dismissed by the judge on the grounds, by the Honorable Bruce Schroeder, on the grounds that Mr. Rittenhouse's weapon was outfitted with a 16-inch long barrel. Mr. Rittenhouse was acquitted of all murder charges on the grounds of self-defense. Rittenhouse actively created the conditions to discharge his weapon into human beings who are unarmed and not brandishing weapons. Both of his victims were white in this case. One was Jewish. Consider the implications of this incident for the racial rule. Because what happened in the aftermath was he was praised by many politicians, particularly in Congress, for his vigilantism. And after he was acquitted, two Congress people had offered him internships at Congress. And he had a short shelf life as a celebrity selling T-shirts. Right? During his, against this backdrop, the contemporary United States seems to be mired in the era of what I'm calling Reconstruction 2.0. At the moment when federal law and troops retreat from the exercise of state sovereignty, even when states do not uphold their own laws regarding open carry, stand your ground, and related laws regarding possession and public display of loaded guns. Now, Timothy Snyder, the political historian, writes a very trenchant short book called On Tyranny, and this is lesson number 6. Excuse me. Lesson number 6, be wary of paramilitaries. Unintentionally highlights the quandary of U.S. democracy. And he says, quote, when the men with guns who have always claimed to be against the system start wearing uniforms and marching with torches and pictures of a leader, the end is nigh. When the pro-leader military, paramilitary, and the official police and military intermingle, the end has come. And yet, several U.S. presidents, congressmen, and senators during the period of Reconstruction tolerated and in some instances encouraged the formation of militias to limit black suffrage and other expressions of black political equality. Their acts beg the question, could the demise of U.S. democracy be glimpsed as early as 1865 with Reconstruction? If one of the distinguishing features of democracies and other forms of political community is a relative absence of political violence, how do we explain the killings of political actors ranging from clergy, community organizers, elected officials, and trade unions involved in several pro-democracy and civil rights movements? So I'm giving you all this context to say this is not new. The U.S. Armed Forces have long struggled with white supremacists in its midst. As recently as 2023, neo-Nazis within the armed forces were circulating weapons to civilians affiliated with these organizations. So they would get the weapons and then they would distribute them to civilian populations. And there are other clues that the United States is entering a period in which the Weberian definition of the state having a monopoly over coercion is uncertain. The Capitol riot of January 6, 2020, anti-state militias marching on the Michigan House of Legislative Assembly, and the riots of Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017 suggest that my conclusion is not bound up with hyperbole. Trump's pardoning of the imprisoned January 6 rioters revealed the paradoxical actions of a government that on the one hand assumes core offices and responsibilities of state, while on the other hand authorizes the very dismantling of the same said state and physical assault on its functionaries by anti-state actors. I mean, there were a lot of police officers, military officials injured on January 6th. Thus, organizations like NFAC and its predecessors represent an ongoing paradox. They are composed of citizens purportedly entitled to the same protections under federal, state, municipal law. And viewed in this manner, black organizations committed to the defense of black lives would be, in an egalitarian, non-racist society and polity, a redundancy. Yet in the absence of state protections, they're not a redundancy. Such groups often undertake what came to be known in the 20s and 30s in both fascist and anti-fascist circles as extra-parliamentary measures in efforts to protect group members from harm. I'm going to skip over some of this. I'm telling Kelly Carter Jackson, a historian who writes about the use of force. So more often than not, black Americans found themselves straddling the spectrum of force and violence to preserve and protect their humanity. One of the recurrent questions in political thought, one has preoccupied thinkers and political actors ranging from Arendt to Fanon, Robespierre to Cabral, Ho Chi Minh to Marinetti, Ruth First to Assata Shakur, the Red Brigade, even the RAF. Historiography by Charles Payne Akinyele Omowale Umoja and Kelly Carter Jackson point to the long array of black responses to white violence through the 1960s and have concluded that white supremacist organizations were less inclined to prey upon armed black communities in the South, Mississippi in particular. At the same time, efforts to secure the safety of black communities through the force of arms have often resulted in an increase of overwhelming force by white mobs in conjunction with or independently of the state. So it could be argued that defense based on physical resistance coercion has been more likely to generate an increase, not a decrease. But that is up for grabs. At the same time, however, it seems clear that any moral gravitas of U.S. civil rights leadership is largely contingent upon an Enlightenment-based Hegelian rendering of the power of Christian morality to eradicate racial hatred and lead the U.S. or any other nation down a path of moral freedom. Given the recurrence of racial hatred over the past 3 centuries, I'm hard-pressed to find an antidote to racism in the hands of any God. Dylan Roof's murder of peaceful parishioners in the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina on June 17, 2015, once again forces us to confront the limitations of sacred remedies to human hatred. Appeals to morality and humanity are relevant to those whose ambitions are bent towards earthly power, not the heavens. Here I am reminded of Rousseau's critique of deistic views of politics and the social contract. Quote, "All power comes from God," Rousseau writes, "I admit, but so does all illness." Does that mean, hold on a second. Does that mean it's forbidden to call a doctor? Rousseau, in other words, we're the doctors to rid societies of popular and state racism. Part of the rationale for focusing on black militancy is to underscore philosophies of action in the face of violence that are not automatic pathways to nonviolence and civil disobedience. While the language of civil disobedience and nonviolence might soothe many in the United States and elsewhere, my hunch is that the rank and file of most minority groups are not attracted to the idea of sacrificing their or their loved ones' bodies in the name of nonviolence, especially when their government and leadership are reluctant to provide state protections, and even more reluctant to bring perpetrators of racist violence to justice. The willingness of black subjects to take up arms against a citizen or representative state is what makes it self-defense as opposed to random violence, a political act, insofar as such acts are responses to the expression of power in the form of coercion, especially in societies and adjoining polities where self-defense as a legal concept and practical act are legal. To repeat the question above, how can one of the most continuous liberal democratic orders have a robust and ideologically diverse paramilitary presence in society and remain a democracy? The subjects noted above who participated in organizations lived under conditions of what Hannah Arendt describes as apolity, semi-citizens or non-citizens in authoritarian situations, and as outlaws because in the societies they inhabited and the polities that excluded them, self-defense for all intents and purposes was a crime punishable by imprisonment, capital murder, or extrajudicial violence. Self-defense organizations are not solely efforts to protect communities from bodily harm. They also constitute distinct conceptualizations of institutions and practices and how people should live in a community, society, or world. There are moments in the collective life of a marginalized people when power and coercion conjoin and bare their teeth. No amount of moral suasion, protest, or indignation can lessen the bite, alter the trajectory of the assassin's bullet, or soften the blow of the interrogator's billy club or brass knuckles. It is a condition, if not the fate, of the truly marginalized who've experienced the lash, the gun, the butt, and the barrel, the fist and the knee, among many other assorted objects of daily life, transformed into instruments of torture. After all the calls for healing and an end to hate based on phenotype, gender, sexual orientation, and others, the dynamics boil down to this. Either the state is willing to protect all of its citizens and anticipate the targeting of some of the most vulnerable, or not. Thank you.
So So we have, thank you very much for your lecture. We do have Yusuf who is waiting to intervene, but because of the internet connection issues, he recorded his intervention. We have the video, which we were going to play first.
Hello and good evening. I'm deeply honored to be the discussant of Professor Hanchard's presentation. And my apologies for being unable to be present in Berlin. But I should say, as a scholar interested in critical race theory and critical decolonial studies, I was extremely delighted to be introduced to Professor Hanchard's work. I actually ordered a copy of his book to be brought to Uganda through a German friend, but unfortunately they were unable to bring it. It's a wonderful moment for me to be discussing Professor Hanchard's presentation. And one of the things that emerges clearly from the presentation is that Professor Hanchard uses the case of the not fucking around coalition to answer the question and also make the case that minority and marginalized communities across their polities should have the moral or even legal right to defend themselves against both the state and fascist groups within the state, especially if they have the protection of the state and they harass their minority compatriots. This is a case, we're not talking about Palestine today, but this is the case of Palestine. That's a conversation for another day. But Hanchard tells us that these groups that emerge do what he has called extra parliamentary measures in the effort to protect group members from harm. In reading and listening to the presentation today, I'm reminded of the joke by comedian Dave Chappelle on how black folks have often served the world and served themselves in the process. In a Netflix special titled Sticks and Stones, which came out in 2019, incidentally, this is the year in which the not fucking around coalition is created. Forgive my language. This is in the text, and in this, and I think later we can talk about the language. So in 2019, when Dave Chappelle gives the Sticks and Stone special, it's the same time that the NFAC is created. So the joke, Dave Chappelle was discussing gun violence, noting that most shooters have tended to be white. He goes, and he says, I don't see any peaceful way to disarm American whites, noting that the African Americans have always served America. Then he suggests, this was an election year, then he suggests, this is an election year, and every able-bodied African American should go and register for a legal firearm. Basically, Chappelle suggested African Americans need to pick up arms and protect their lives. And as Professor Hanchard demonstrates, there have been generations of African Americans actually picking up arms to save America and in the process serve themselves. But I would like to take a step back and instead of using Carl Schmitt, which Professor Hanchard has used, the concept of partisans, rather place NFAC in critical race theory scholarship and decolonial studies. I think the beginning part is that racial subjugation and the low regard of Black life ought to be seen through the lens of the political economy of racism. Then and now, racism thrives because it has economic value to the point that even supposedly progressive racial segregation in the United States happened partly because of the economic benefits that white America had seen elsewhere. In assessing Brown versus Board of Education, Derek Bell tells us what he called interest convergency, that the legislation was possible after many years of litigation because white America appreciated that the African Americans in the South had to stop wasting time in campaigning for racial equality. So the board, Brown versus Board of Education legislation against segregated schools happened in the time it happened because white America had seen economic benefit elsewhere. Indeed, to make this even more powerfully, Ava DuVernay's movie, 13th Amendment, demonstrates the benefit of racial capitalism, including mass incarceration of Black folks, so as to both deny them what is due to them as American citizens, but also to extract value in form of free labor from them. So here, it becomes more evident that the struggle for racial equality is similar to anti-colonial struggles in the subaltern world. And this is a point that Hanchard has rightly pointed out. It's a struggle against exploitation. Indeed, even in decolonial studies, we realize that to exploit the African and other indigenous communities across the world, the first people to pick slaves from Africa and elsewhere found themselves in a moral quandary that they had to find reason to actually pillage their resources, because they didn't see them as subhumans. First, they appreciated their humanity, but they had to actually dehumanize them. And this is the corpus of Edward Said's book, Orientalism. And Siba Grovogi has also made the same argument in his book, Sovereigns, Quasi-Sovereigns and Africans, where he shows that the Pope had to issue a binding religious argument where he issued the papal bulls to enable the first slave raiders to actually go back and raid more slaves. So the point I'm making here is this, that the Black community in the United States exists in a colonial extractive relationship with the state itself and their other white supremacist compatriots. And so understanding this relationship spotlights Black African resistance much more vividly. So if that's the context that we've established, the Not Fucking Around Coalition, like the groups before it, the Universal Negro Improvement Organization, Black Panther Party, Sambaionese Liberation Army, you see them as a derivative project in the sense that they are responding to the language that the exploiter understands. And to paraphrase Fanon, this is the language of violence. I realized that concluding his talk, Professor Hanchard sounds a bit despondent. He seems challenged on how to see a way through. He doesn't appear to fully embrace the line of violence, arguing that it ends in more violence against the marginalized groups, but also he's entirely unready to condone it because he belongs to the radical, Marxist Malcolm X tradition. But I want to say this. I want to put the collapse of the NFAC coalition, Black Panther, the UNIA Legionnaires, in the decolonial trajectory. They ought to be seen as political projects, not simply political acts. I want to see their rise and fall not as a weakness, but as a true component of anti-colonial struggles. Resistance projects have tended to be short-term, sometimes disorganized, and oftentimes messy. Indeed, they are supposed to die, and then in their death, they re-emerge under a new name and a new texture. Thus, NFAC, Black Panther, Black Lives Matter all need to be seen as political projects. In fact, if they had stayed longer, they risk being institutionalized and turned into charity organizations. Their strength, for me, their power is that they are born in a peculiar context, demonstrate the urgency of that context, and then they disappear. Well, they get dismantled, as happened with NFAC, but they would have planted the seeds of struggle. In concluding my remarks, I will end with a small point that Professor Hanchard uses, to demand for civil liberties and civil rights when he uses the language of democracy. Our finest understanding of democracy nowadays is that democracy equals free markets, in the sense that there's a market space selling a product, and that product is legislation. So if you get supposedly progressive legislations, those legislations are often negotiated in the marketplace. So you can look at IPAC, or you can look at the American Legislative Executive Council, ALEC, which is in charge of sort of suggesting legislation for prisoners. What you get under democratic dispensation are legislations which are negotiated in the marketplace. And in critical decolonial scholarship, what becomes more visible is that what often appears supposedly progressive legislations are often born in a different context, and for Black communities, is often an exploitative context. So the point I'm trying to say here is that we need to find a new language to articulate the demand for civil liberties, not one where legislations are sold in the marketplace. I thank you so much for having me. And again, my apologies for not being with you in Berlin, but maybe next time I'll have the chance to be with you in Berlin. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much, Yusuf, for your input. I'd like to give you the floor now, Professor Hanchard, to respond if you want, and then we open to Q&A.
Hello. Hello. Okay, good. Okay. Great comments, actually. I was nodding my head in agreement with the overwhelming majority of what you have said. A couple of comments and then responses. One of the things that's interesting about the current moment is that on the one hand, we think about not just NFAC, but other organizations in the United States. It speaks as much to not just U.S. racism, but the peculiarity of U.S. political culture more generally, particularly the fascination with weapons and the fascination with guns. And what I'm writing in my book, there's more elaborate discussion here of how this moment has not only led to the militarization of Black communities, but you have now queer gun clubs, lesbian gun clubs, you have the redneck revolts, the left-wing, white working class groups. You have a national organization called the John Brown Society, basically taking the name after the white abolitionists who believed in armed struggle, dotted all across the country. So people, in many ways, it's a larger response to the question that this talk was entitled, "If the state won't protect me, who will?" The discussion of Palestine, I certainly agree with. The political economy of racism. Well, let me start first with your mention of Fanon and Arendt. And Arendt's essay on violence, I think, is very apt here because her critique of Fanon basically is premised on that violence is not really a politics. The fact that it can be used as an instrument in a variety of different senses means that it doesn't have an ideology as such. And the idea that somehow violence is redeeming of the oppressed is what she critiques and questions. However, Ho Chi Minh believed in this for the context of the colonial struggle. I think there are some limits in making the comparison between using the colonial analogy to talk about U.S. African-American experience. There's a great exchange that Amilcar Cabral had. He gave an informal talk at the UN about 4 months before he was assassinated. And I think it's called Unity and Struggle, if I'm not mistaken. But there's a recording or transcript of his discussion. It's called the Informal Talk with the Black Community, American Community. And one of the distinctions he makes is that unlike Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and the like, the U.S. African Americans constitute a minority population. They're not indigenous to the United States. They don't occupy the same kind of territory. So there's a certain limitation in terms of drawing that analogy. That analogy was very popular in the late 70s with what came to be known as the internal colony thesis. William Tabb and Herbert Blauner kind of elaborated on the thesis, and Donald Harris, actually, Kamala Harris's father is an economist, wrote a brilliant rejoinder to that formulation. But I think that where I agree is I think part of what you sense, and I think this is dead on, Professor Serunkuma, is I am struggling with, in an intellectual way, trying to find a language that neither glorifies violence, but also, in some sense, moves us away from the fetishization of nonviolence And the work of Akinyele Umoja is a really brilliant book. It's called We Will Shoot Back. And he provides primary evidence and detail to show how many of the civil rights marches and movements in the U.S. South during the Reign of Terror in the 1950s and 60s, those civil rights activists were often accompanied by or were trailed by people who were armed. And many of those people who participated in the nonviolent movement by day carried weapons at night, and often to protect people coming from the north. So in instances where some pretty famous instances where Medgar Evers was killed, for example, it was because someone mysteriously was not part of the protection detail that was supposed to protect him. The 3 civil rights workers from the north that came that were drowned in Mississippi, something similarly happened to them. So we have to have a more complicated understanding of this relationship between force and nonviolence. Let me stop there.
All right, I'm going to abuse my my capacity as chair to ask you both a question, because I'm not very clear in the way in which the dialogue has unfolded, whether you both agree that Fanon's contribution is useful, and whether the theory of violent resistance would be applicable or not. If it is applicable, how do you deal and how do you address the question of legitimacy? So do we go with Arendt and we think that violence is like the zeroing of politics, and is the anti-politics, is the non-politics? And if not, if there are exceptions, are there any limits to this counter-violence, this shooting back, this responsive, defensive recourse to force? And are recourses to force always akin to violence that might not be justifiable if we follow Arendt? Or is there really a difference between certain forms of force or coercion that might not always amount to illegitimate violence? Maybe, I don't know if both of you would like to chip in, and then we can open to questions.
Thank you so much for that question. And thank you, Professor Hanchard, for your response to what I found in your talk, a sort of a quandary to a degree that you're in between and you're struggling to find a language. Yeah. But I am very Fanonian in this context. Mm-hmm. I grew up in the Carter Corridor, and what we say in the Carter Corridor is that once a fire is lit on the other side, to put it out, you start a fire on the other side so that both fires meet. At that meeting point, then they settle themselves out, right? So that's the principle of Fanon that. And I think it's Jean-Paul Sartre reading Fanon, where he said, at that point when the colonizer learned that the only language that the exploiter understood was the language of violence, they responded in the same language. We say in many places that power determines the way it is opposed. The way the drums were beaten is the way the dancer danced on the floor. So if power sets the language, it sets the tone of negotiation as violence, then the colonized, because I said blacks live in sort of extractive colonial relationship with the state, the colonized has no choice. It's not a choice they choose, but it is forced onto them to respond in the language that the exploiter understands. And I think that's a sort of it's a difficult thing to say now that, it sounds like glorifying violence. But it's a choice imposed onto the colonized. And I think, that's where we find ourselves, talking about Palestine, talking about events in many parts of the colonized world, that the colonized tend to find themselves responding in that language. Even Nelson Mandela's struggle was mostly civil. He was appearing in court, arguing out cases, but they found themselves pushed against the wall that they had to find in Koto Sizwe, which was the military wing of the ANC. So that's, in my way, I'll be very Fanonian in this context.
These are insightful comments. I would agree. I think that it's easy to make certain moral declarations about what a population should or should not do in the absence of recognition of what the dynamic tensions that they're faced with. I think that I think where I struggled is particularly over the past few years. To give you an example, there was I taught at Johns Hopkins before I was at Pennsylvania, and I watched with interest the deliberations of activists in Baltimore after the killing of Freddie Gray, right? I'm familiar with that. We were dragged into a paddy wagon. Basically, it was already lost use of his legs, and he died. But activists were talking about different strategies, and one of them was the possibility of approaching the Longshoremen's Union that ran the ports in the city of Baltimore. The city of Baltimore is a big port. And at the time, the head of the Longshoremen's Union was a black person, and the workers were predominantly black. And there was some discussion about the possibility of shutting down the port. Now that's not necessarily violence, it's not nonviolence, but it certainly would be a real challenge to capital, right? The problem was, and this is when the bulb went off in my head, when I started talking with some of the actors, I said, okay, well, you're gonna need a phalanx of lawyers, because once you start doing stuff like that, you're in the realm of U.S. federal felonies and marshals. So you need people to get you out of jail, you need people to defend your case in court, you might have to be willing to have a whole phalanx of leaders do prison time. Are you prepared to do any of that? And they were not prepared. So if you're not prepared, and I realized then, it's not through lack of imagination, it's not through cowardness, it's through the fact that the U.S. government, but not just U.S. government, state power is one of the sort of most monumental and also horrific inventions of modern politics. And how does one deal with overwhelming force, right? So it's not so much that I am necessarily for or against violence, and I'm certainly not against self-defense. But the question becomes, it's one thing to get into some individual or small group altercation. It's another thing to take on the whole state. This is something else altogether on a territory that you are not in a majority. And important to remember that. How many familiar with Fred Hampton? Yes, no? You in the back. Who was Fred Hampton? Yes. What happened to him? All right, you got it started. So Fred Hampton was, okay.
The Chicago police and FBI assassinated him.
Exactly. They killed him in his sleep. Okay, extrajudicial killing. And he was, at the time, I think he was still a teenager, and he was probably one of the most formidable activists, not just for the Panther Party, but in that moment of the Black freedom struggle. And when the state began to pay attention to him was when he began to make trips from Chicago down to Appalachia to talk to the white working class. And he started to develop coalitions and alliances with white working class communities. And that's when the FBI came. So there's a great the documentary in Bravery, not that happened to him. There's a documentary by Sam Pollard called The Murder of Fred Hampton that provides the details. Let me shut up.
Perfect. We're going to open up. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I just want to make one or 2 points. Very briefly.
We just if they can be semi-brief, so that then people can
It's my fault. I'll give you my time.
ask questions to the both of you. Yeah. Go for it.
Okay. I mean, I just wanted to say that I appreciate the dilemma with the democratic world. That the language of democracy disguises the violence.
Yes.
Democracy is a very violent modernity,
yes,
but
yes.
When you speak democracy, the violence is disguised.
Yes.
You could say it depoliticizes it, makes it look technical.
Yes.
So responders are hard pressed to, speak the language of violence in a space which is democratic.
Yes.
Right. So that's the dilemma that in American spaces, in supposedly definitively democratic spaces, that the violence is often hidden. It's very technical, yet actually the people feel it in their daily lives, right? So I appreciate that dilemma. The second point I wanted to stress is that there are key lessons from our anti-colonial struggles. That, struggles were often short-term. They were broken down. Dedan Kimathi would be hanged. Nelson Mandela would be thrown in jail. Patrice Lumumba would be murdered. Our leaders of these sort of radical struggles are often, somehow taken off. But then the struggles keeps rolling, and we register small victories and small successes. And then, too bad for us in the subaltern world, I think for African Americans too, is that this is the life we are born into, of constant struggle and constant one piece at a time.
Okay, I'm going to take questions. So we can have a first round, group them, and then get back to you for responses. Sure. If anyone would like to launch. Any questions? Please, the microphone is coming. Can you introduce yourself and then pose your question?
Yuan Hao, just a guy who is interested in global history in some aspects. I've heard your talk. It's very touching to me personally, and I've also Googled the pictures throughout history and from the very beginning of black people coming to the US. It's very, I would like to ask another question, which motivates you to stay here today to tell us your story about this field of science, which gives you hope in the recent researches.
Michaela, when we were talking about hope earlier, I'll take other questions.
Okay, all right. So I think we can do up to 3.
Hello, I'm Andrew. I'm a student here at Hertie School. Thank you for the talk. I'm curious, I feel like in the US, there's a lot of perception with Black power struggle as being this thing that happened, with Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, and it ended kind of in the 60s with COINTELPRO. And since then, what has happened? You mentioned the Not Fucking Around Coalition, short-lived, kind of like a very small organization. I'm curious, what is this sort of resistance looking like in a post-COINTEL world? How can groups like this even organize, especially when there's non-violent, activists in Georgia with the Stop Cop City movement who are being charged with terrorism?
Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Okay, and Ruth, you had a question as well?
I'm Ruth Dittelmann, professor of social psychology. Thank you also for your talk. I was wondering about the question of gender. So I think you take an intersectional lens, but then in your remarks today, you talked about violence against women, but you didn't really talk about the inclusion of women in the resistance movements. And I was wondering to what extent these movements are gender inclusive and whether that matters for the cause. Should they be?
Would you like to respond, or do we take? There is one more hand over there. Shall we take the other hand?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Hi, also a student here, and my question is kind of directly to the agenda for today. If the state won't protect me, who will? And what I'm taking away so far is that perhaps coalitions will do that across the boundaries that the state fragments us. So you mentioned there are more and more gun groups by queer, feminist, working class groups as well. Is that towards the direction in which we should be organizing as in let's say the people that are disenfranchised and actively violated, whose rights are violated on a daily basis across the world?
Okay, let me answer these.
Yeah, please go ahead. We need the microphone because otherwise,
Let me answer these in turn. So I was talking to Professor Cranfeld about this earlier today, and after my last book, I would often get these questions. People say, well, how can we feel hopeful? Where's the hope? And my response is generally that I'm not in the hope business. That's not what I do. I'm paid to analyze unpleasant things, unfortunately. But I do believe in the words of the French anarchist Romain Rolland, who said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And I think it gets to Professor's comments as well, that I think Enzo Traverso, the historian, writes of the history of the international left as being glorious losers, that they're constantly, the 20th century, they're always coming up short. And I think in some ways it kind of links into Gramsci's discussion, the methodological criteria for the study of the subaltern, about the ways in which certain subaltern movements are fragmented and episodic, right? They often don't have a linear, continuous kind of history. So they often operate in kind of fits and starts. And I think that, in many ways, is one of the only hopeful ways to kind of think through these political problems, again, when one is confronted and one is faced with this overwhelming force. Question 3. Yeah, certainly, that's why I started out talking about Solani Davis's work. But the quick answer is the Movement for Black Lives was founded by 2 black women, Patrisse Cullors and the second person, basically galvanizing against certain forms of extrajudicial violence and killing. I think one of the interesting things about Movement for Black Lives, it was heavily criticized by some of the civil rights establishment. And one of the criticisms was that there's no leadership, to which they responded, we're not leaderless, we're leaderful. So it meant that they had a leadership tradition that was much more rooted in the organizing practices of someone like Ella Baker than, say, Martin Luther King, right? Much more horizontal, much more generative and sharing and collaborative. So, and I think that there's a great book by a political scientist at Brown, a young political scientist named Devorah Woodley. And she wrote a book, came out a couple years ago, called Reckoning. And one of the things that she writes about is that's different about that, version of black freedom struggle activism, is there's a much more emphasis on what Foucault used to refer to near the end of his life as the ethics of care, because they recognized and understood the ways in which movement struggle made people crazy. It led them to alcoholism, it led them to violence. Many organizations were too porous to begin with. And I think it's no accident that these were women theorizing through some of these things about the ethics of care. How does care relate to the social movement struggle? And so that's my answer to that. The last question, yeah, I think that, I can't tell what to do, but I do think that in part because it's not a specifically anti-colonial struggle, that the need for coalitions and the old definition of politics is the art of the possible means that people have to transcend demographic barriers. It's not a matter of multiculturalism, touchy-feely, but you say, look, okay, if we queers are in the same boat, if embattled black communities are in the same boat, if the comedian by the name of Earthquake, who can be hilarious, and he did a show. A lot of this comes out in humor, because the commentary now in the United States for political culture is so toxic that it's mostly comedians who actually make some of the most insightful commentary about politics. And so Earthquake said, he went to his audience and said, look, I'm speaking now directly to my Latino brothers and sisters. You have my support, best of luck, right? Right, so it's a way to say, look, you ended up in the same boat that we did. So the question becomes now, what do we do about it, right? And that's what social movement means. It's getting people to actually move from point A to point B and understand that there are certain commonalities in those struggles.
Thank you very much. So I would like to give the possibility to Dr. Sarunkuma to join in if there is anything that you would like to add in response to the questions.
I just want to say one thing, one small comment from our anti-colonial struggle. There's a big book, although I learned recently, but it was written by a CIA operative. The book Everyday Forms of Resistance. And I think the book Everyday Forms of Resistance, that theorization gives us the opportunity to see the small struggles, the accumulation of small struggles every day, which are individual, not collative, individual, which tend to end in defeat. But the accumulation of these everyday struggles, which are very small, including things such as telling lies or telling a hard joke, or just being lazy in executing a command of the oppressor, those small struggles need to be registered as part of the collective struggle. And I think the point I mostly wanted to stress in my comment was that, the NFAC, after 4 years, is almost, it's disbanded completely with all the leaders arrested. But I want to appreciate the time it lived. It sowed the seeds of the struggle that right now is the basis of our conversation to a degree. That in itself ought to be appreciated. So I think this is quite common in political economy, especially in everyday forms of resistance. There's a lot of scholarship on it, but the small struggles of women, of men, scattered groups, which tend to end in defeat and most times go unrecognized as part of the collective struggle, and they need to be registered.
Thank you very much. So we have the element of the sediment of these small struggles to bear in mind, and the transversality of all the different coalitions that can form intentionally or unexpectedly. I wonder if people will have more questions. I think we have time for one more round. One question, two. So anyone who didn't have an opportunity yet, who would like to, please remember to introduce yourselves and put the question in. It was here.
Thank you for your talk. It was really rich in so many references from like a wide variety of disciplines, and I really appreciated that. I guess I wanted to ask about what you think people like us within academia, or philosophers in particular, what is sort of our role in, I guess, protecting subaltern communities? And I know that, for example, philosophers in the African-American philosophers like Angela Davis, and they haven't been entirely separated from work on the ground at all. But traditionally, sort of academia is conceived as this sort of ivory tower. And I was wondering, in particular, if there's a way in which we can connect the fragmented movements of the subaltern with some sort of vocabulary or theory, and that could be our role, or like what your thoughts are.
Thank you very much. We can, I think, take one more if anyone would have a burning issue. If not, I'm happy to go back. There's one more question. Okay, thank you.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your lecture and for the comments. I'm Thomas. I'm from a student from Hertie. I have a very loose observation. Maybe you can reflect on this, but we're talking about language of violence. Can we translate this into like a language of power, a language of means, and in more like owning a huge company, for example, like the most easiest ways to put it, like means of power in terms of economic power? Is this also something that plays a role?
Thank you for that. Shall we come back to you now?
Yeah.
Yeah?
So I guess
we need the microphone.
Yeah, let me start with the last one first. No, certainly there are many different types of power. Certainly the discussion of racial capitalism gets at this question of political economy and how the slave trade was central to first the development of mercantile capitalism. and then later subsequently industrial capitalism. So yeah, I think that's pretty well established. The role of the intellectual, this is an old question that I'm not sure is easily answered. I mean, I think that part of it, I think there's, Angela Davis is a very hard, if not impossible, act to follow. I was with her a few years ago, and the fact that she could be so healthy and beaming after all that she's been through and not destroyed is just a testament to her force of will. Because most people did not come through that period unscathed. And I think there's a reason for that. You know, the psychic cost of that kind of struggle and that kind of repression. So I don't really have an answer to, I mean, it's not clear to me that there's any one particular way or role that scholars should interact or interface with activists. I just don't know. There's the classic philosophy born of struggle. I don't know if you've seen that by Leonard Harris. It's an old, now it's probably as old as I am. So a collection of essays put together by a group of black philosophers in the 70s that kind of laid out what they thought that agenda was. But I mean, that would be one place to look. One, I think, point of fruitful dialogue and disagreement. I mean, I think that you mentioned James Scott. That's what I'm assuming you're referring to. And I don't know if you're familiar. I mean, I've learned a lot from his work. I found his work very powerful. And at the same time, it was clear he had a certain anarchist sensibility. And it wasn't just that he was, in the end, a CIA operative, but he provided information that led to the deaths of several communist organizers in Indonesia, right? So, and you know, and that dance, if you will, between the state and social movements in the 60s and 70s was a lot more prevalent than people know. So for example, I can go on too long, so I don't want to, but just say one quick point. Eldridge Cleaver, who was Minister of Information for the Black Panther Party, it was discovered he too was on the CIA payroll, right? And it was coincided with the same time that the Black Panther Party moved and began to advocate much more vociferously for the question of aggressive violence that Huey Newton and others were opposed to. So we can ask ourselves a question: why and when the turn to violence, right? Why make a turn to violence when again, you're facing overwhelming force, overwhelming odds?
Thank you very much, and I think that's a good point to end a great discussion. So do watch the space for the published version of this work, which it's going to be taking the form of a book, and
hopefully it will
hopefully in June.
Yes.
So we will let you know. Please join me in thanking the two wonderful speakers we have had this evening. Thank you very much.